Serena is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Cardiff, UK. Her research interests include translation and sexuality, cultural exchange between the US and Italy, and the history of gay social movements. She published the article Tick as Appropriate, A, Gay, B, Queer, C, None of the Above, Translation and Sexual Politics in Lawrence Venuti's 100 Strokes of the Brush Before Bed, which appeared in Comparative Literature Studies. And she was awarded her PhD from Warwick University in the UK in Italian Studies and Translation Studies. So we're very excited to have her here today. Thank you so much all for coming, and I'd like to welcome Serena Bassi.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for coming to this. It's very excited to be here. So I'm going to start in medias res. I'm going to start right into our topic for today, getting you to read a quote, which is by a very active and prominent lesbian activist in the US, Sarah Schulman. And the reason this has really little to do with what I'm actually going to talk about later, but I am really interested in how this for me encompasses really a lot of the questions that I'm looking at. And particularly, I love how it captures a set of anxieties around the location of sexuality, and particularly the location of homosexuality and homosexual identity. So there's a whole thing going on here about desperately trying to pin down a place from which certain sexual constructions come from. And really, this is what we're going to try and unravel together today. With some of the theory that we're going to be looking at. Also, another slight tangent, there was a debate, which I'm sure you guys are even more better to talk about than I am really, a debate around using .gay as an international, as a transnational domain name for every website and every blog in the world that would contain material around sexuality that can't quite be contained within the idea of heterosexuality. So this was a move that has been proposed and was obviously very controversial, and a series of really kind of important, urgent questions came out of that debate. And some of these questions are really what I would like to discuss with you today, and what I'm constantly thinking about in my work. The questions are: what does it mean to use an English word as universal marker for anyone, anywhere, who doesn't live a heterosexual life? Does the word gay mean the same thing wherever it is used? So, as I'm sure you're aware, gay is constantly being localized. So it's an English word originally, but we use it in Italian, we say gay. They use it in Latin America, they use it in several Asian countries as well. So the word gay, does that actually mean the same thing wherever it is used? How does the use of an English word impact on people's ability to identify with the identity that word supposedly stands for? So a series of questions there around identification and language that I'm asking. Why am I asking those questions? So not very much has been written, unfortunately, about English as a language on the internet. One of the most useful sources that I found is Ethan Zuckerman's text Rewire, in which he poses the problem very clearly of the dominance, the hegemony of English as the language of the internet. So Zuckerman kind of unravels the problem quite interestingly by saying language is a tool. And tools should be invisible. We should be able to just use them without needing to interrogate them all the time. But they do become visible when we don't have access to that very tool. So as one of the most pervasive and powerful tools that we use, language biases what we encounter and what we fail to encounter every day. So then Zuckerman very straightforwardly says, there is a solution to this. It's quite simply translation. So we should have more local languages translated from English on the internet. So the same kind of blog, the same sources, translated in several languages for access and for a kind of more democratic reach, really. So I'd like to problematize this whole perspective by saying that actually because a lot of the English that we do find on the internet is not written by native speakers of English, I would like to suggest that we need to reconceptualize the very way we think of translation. Translation is already embedded in the language that we read. So the text that we see as a solid English text that seems to us to be an original is in fact entrenched in processes of translation, and is produced by processes of translation which are already in it. So it's actually already a hybrid text. So I think this really pushes us to rethink what translation is. So I found a really interesting text very much on this that brings together my interest in sexual globalization and my interest in language and translation. So in the Gay Archipelago, Tom Verstroff sets two things against one another. It talks about translation, traditional translation, just meaning an interlingual process where you have text in one language and then you produce an equivalent text in another language, and he sees that as not really speaking to the contemporary media landscape. So he then comes up with a new concept, and he talks about a dubbing culture. So in dubbing, obviously in fact you might not have seen that many dubbed films because you're native speakers of English, but I'm sure you know what a dubbed film looks like, right? So in dubbing, speech and gesture never perfectly match. You can close your eyes and hear perfect speech, or mute the sound and see perfect gesture, but no original unites the two in the dubbed production. Disjuncture is at the heart of the dub. There is no prior state of pure synchrony and no simple conversion to another way of being. So I'm very interested here in how identity and ways of being are being brought into the conversation about translation and moving across cultural boundaries. Where traditional translation is haunted by its inevitable failure, the kind of impossibility of perfect equivalence, dubbing rejoices in the good enough and in the forever incomplete. So I really want you to think about this when we talk about our localization of the Getzbats project in a minute, which is really what I'm looking at. So my goal for today is to offer a series of reflections on the Getzbats project, the YouTube campaign that encourages LGBT adults to address supportive messages to young victims of homophobic bullying. And my interest is in the specific ideas of what homophobia is and how it should be fought that inform the campaign. So I'm looking at definitions of homophobia within the campaign. What makes my analysis different from existing analysis of this and other cultural products centered upon queer representation on the Web 2.0 is that my main focus is not on an English language product, but rather on a localization. So what I'm looking at is that, again, translated text, a derivative text, rather than an original. So again, the reason why homosexuality, which is really what I'm looking at today, as a construction, the reason why it's so resonant to conversations about dubbing culture is because traditionally the homosexual subject has always been constructed as always coming from abroad. So this is not specific on one particular national homophobic discourse. As you might have seen in the news, when the Olympics were on, there was a lot of, in Russia, there was a lot of conversation about those kind of anxieties, about homosexuality being brought into the confines of the nation. But I would like to stress that that's not typical of Russia now, but it's typical really, it's a staple of nationalist discourse that homosexual always comes from abroad. And even in George Chauncey's very, very interesting history of gay New York, there's this really important quote which just brings home what I'm trying to say really. The English tended to blame homosexuality on the French, and the French to blame it on the Italians, but the Americans just blamed it rather more indiscriminately on European immigration as a whole. And there's a particular way in which that ties back into our discourse on sexual globalization, in that, as Postdoctoral suggests, the moment of looking at global media products and recognizing yourself, and recognizing your identity being represented there, is a moment where the deictic "that's me" places the self in a dialogic relationship with a distant but familiar other. So in that way, subjectivity immediately becomes located, the subjectivity that you strive towards achieving and you identify yourself with is also then located in the translocal. And again, so this doesn't just work in terms of positive, it doesn't just work in terms of I look at that identity and I see it abroad and I strive towards it. There's also a mapping of intolerance. There's also, I'm really interested in this map, not for the facts that it seeks to represent, but more about, I'm more interested in how we've come to at this point in time to be able to index homophobia and place it and map it clearly so that we know that some countries score low and other score high, so that we can have a kind of spatial understanding of homophobia, which seems really a really particular thing to me, and it also engages discourses of the national in very particular ways, which we're going to be looking at. Okay, so I actually would like to take you through a little bit of theory now, which might be not the most exciting part, but I do need to share a little bit of context with you. So the English language word gay has become the operative term of homosexual political activism well beyond the English-speaking world. As an identity category, gay is commonly seen, as I'm sure you also see it, as self-evidently describing people who engage in same-sex practices everywhere in the world. Against the historical backdrop of late modernity, this identity category travels through a variety of acts of interlingual and cultural translation. In fact, the origin, it's very important to me that we understand that the origin of this politically productive paradigm, the very idea of gay, is in fact found in 20th century US history. Thus, to make critical sense of this translational dynamics, it is actually urgent to first spend a little bit of time interrogating gay as a sign representing not a self-evident category, but a situated construct that is entrenched in a series of conceptualizations of identity, community, oppression, and liberation that are really entwined with specific US political histories. So asking how a politically loaded concept such as gay is moved from its original context and localized confronts us with the politics at play in the formation and in the subsequent referencing of such a concept. It also forces us to consider carefully the repertoires that are linked to the concept in the culture from which it derives. So the historian and activist John D'Emilio articulated an earlier critique of gay identity in 1979 from a Marxist position. In the seminal text, Capitalism and Gay Identity, D'Emilio problematizes the ahistorical notions of identity, the same ahistorical notions with identity that I think we are all becoming more and more kind of accustomed to and familiar with. The historical notions of identity and subcultural belonging that had become commonplace within the 1970s gay movement. It grants the growth of a subculture of male and female homosexuals in urban America in the 1950s and 60s, which had prepared the grounds for the Stonewall riots in New York City in 1969. He grants that kind of growth of subcultures in the economic conditions without which that growth would never have been possible. D'Emilio then argues that gay people need to understand their own positionality historically, as well as their existence as a phenomenon within capitalism, in order to gain a political awareness of their contradictory place within it, marked as it is by the constant interplay between exploitation and some measure of autonomy, which is typical of patterns of social progress in capitalist societies. So the concept of gay community, again, one that I'm sure we're all very familiar and kind of conversing with, is critical to understanding how the dialectic of autonomy and exploitation plays out for the contemporary gay subject. Underpinning the notion of a gay community is the idea that those subjects who are knowable through the concept of a gay identity have common interests, they have a common way of life, a common culture, and common political objectives. But from the 90s onwards, the idea of a gay community has developed more and more into a market niche, producing a consumer lifestyle and a consumer identity. So then, within LGBT theory and queer theory particularly, you then have the notion of a new homonormativity, which can take from the more visible notion of heteronormativity, which is obviously a critique of heterosexuality, but then queer theory comes up with this idea of homonormativity, which is a counterpart of heteronormativity and refers to a prescribed and narrow representation of contemporary gay subjects that colludes with and bolsters dominant ideologies. So the person who devised this idea, Lisa Duggan, talks about homonormativity as a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them, while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency and a privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. Globalization then comes along and facilitates, this is a very sketchy kind of summary, but just for you to be with me when I'm going into my case study. Globalization facilitates processes of internationalization of this paradigm of gay identity. So the so-called internationalization of the gay community is a product of the global visibility of lesbians and gay men in the market through the international distribution of gay newspapers, books, films, and other media. The expansion of international gay tourism to gay-friendly holiday destinations, and obviously access to the internet. So a translation scholar Michael Cronin suggests that globalization is an ongoing process of translation, in which every locale experiences the transformations that globalization brings in specific ways, and, quote from Cronin, each country or community translates elements of the global and informational economy into local circumstances. Similarly, the processes of the internationalization of the gay community is also, I would suggest, a process of translation, in which an original US archive of sexual alterity is translated and renegotiated in local contexts. This process of cultural translation takes place in a web of inequalities, as do other aspects of globalization, as we know. The idealized image of a transnational gay community overlooks the fact that not everyone in the world who experiences same-sex desires will have the economic means and the privileges of unrestricted rights to travel, which are necessary to participate in the global gay life, the primary sites of which are Western urban centers such as the very city we're in, San Francisco, Berlin, just to name a few, London, obviously. So I'm interested here really in bringing together this particular critique of globalization with the kind of the homonormative archive that emerges out of LGBT representation in the US context. So when we look at queer representation through a transnational prism, the homonormative ideal appears to be one of those US cultural themes that dominate the international cultural markets. Because the idea of a gay identity is grounded in a set of subcultural experiences and histories that are situated in specific locales within the West, the use of this term as a value-free universal category to describe same-sex desires and same-sex relationship is contested. Its politically loaded histories also make its cultural transfer a sensitive operation. So, in particular, when translated outside the West entirely, gay identity may not simply be received grade-free as the perfect vehicle of the battle against the violence of homophobia, Joseph Massad, for example, in this context argues that the concept of gay identity can exercise its own epistemic violence and even unwittingly collude with homophobia when it presents itself as the default instrument to describe anything that exists outside heterosexual paradigms. I'm referring here to Joseph Massad's really, really eye-opening book, Desiring Arabs, where he makes the point, he kind of talks about a gay international, very controversially, and kind of interrogates the problems with unequivocally positing everyone who engaging in same-sex practices in the Muslim world in particular as gay victims of Muslim homophobia, with these two kind of ideas, gay victim and Muslim homophobia, as two kind of solid, impossible to contest kind of monolithic entities. So, so here what we're looking at really is a critique of the Western model as the only liberatory telos to be applied universally. So obviously my case study is very different. I'm looking at two cultural contexts that do not have the same power relations that Massad is talking about, because I'm talking about the United States, but and Italy, which is obviously also a Western country. But what I'm interested in is pointing out that there are issues of power at play, even when the categories of political agency that are being transferred from one cultural context to another are cast in emancipatory and liberal discourse. So that doesn't quite kind of, it doesn't mean we're off the hook if we kind of phrase things around emancipation and liberation. That's what I really wanted to point out. But then I'm adding something to this, and I'm adding my own perspective as a translation scholar and as a translator. As a translator, I know that a text that is being translated is never just a copy of an original, that a lot of agency of the translator necessarily comes into play. So the disciplinary tools of translation studies can help us in complicating Massad's view of cultural exchange, which is in fact reductive and also kind of traps us in a authenticity kind of false kind of problem, really. So translation scholar Lawrence Venuti clarifies when discussing the political implications of translation in late modernity by saying that the globalization of English, the emergence of a world market for English language cultural products, ensures that translations don't merely communicate British and American values, but rather they submit them to a local differentiation, an assimilation to the heterogeneity of a minor position. Okay, so I think this is enough for the theoretical context. I've lectured you enough, really. I would like to now just remind you of the actual what we're talking about. So I'll show you the first video of the It Gets Better campaign. Do people know of this anti-homophobic campaign? Yeah. But just because I'm going to speak to the first video in particular, I might just show it to you.
High school was bad. I was Catholic, went to Catholic high school, Catholic boys' school. My dad was a Catholic deacon, my mom was a Catholic lay minister, and my family was very Catholic. And there were no gay people in my family, and no gay people in my school, but I was picked on because, like musicals, and I was obviously gay, and some kids didn't like that, but I did get harassed.
My school was pretty miserable. I lived in Spokane, Washington, which is a mid-sized town with a small town mentality. And I was picked on mercilessly in school. People were really cruel to me. I was bullied a lot, beat up, thrown against walls and lockers and windows, stuffed into bathroom stalls. People shit on my car. People scratched my car, broke my windows. And my parents went in and wanted to talk to the school administrators about the harassment I was getting at school, and they basically said, if you look that way, talk that way, walk that way, act that way, then there's nothing we can do to help your son. Honestly, things got better the day I went to high school. I didn't see the bullies every day. I didn't see the people who harassed me every day. I didn't have to see the school administrators who do nothing about it every day. Life instantly got better.
If there are 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds out there watching this video, what I'd love you to take away from it really is that it gets better. However bad it is now, it gets better. And it can get great, and it can get awesome. Your life can be amazing, but you have to tough this period of it out, and you have to live your life so you're around for it to get amazing, and it can and it will. When I first came out to my folks, they weren't thrilled. My mother said she never wanted to meet any of my boyfriends or boyfriend. I was going to bring a man around that I was dating in the house never. And my mother recently passed away. And she told me to let Terry know that she loved him like a daughter. And she did. Love you like you were my spouse. And she was welcome in the house. And our families are really accepting. And you would think that my evangelical Catholic parents, and Terry's conservative Christian parents, who sent him to the Catholic school, that our families would reject us forever and never get over it and wouldn't embrace us. And both of our families, Terry's family, his mom and stepdad, and my family, love us and accept us and include us.
We're treated with the love and respect that we deserve as friends and family. And it's great. We're great families. We met out at a bar. I was out dancing, and
I was out staring at you boys dancing because I was there.
And I came up to talk to a friend of mine who was in drag working the coat check, and Dan was there.
And I had been saying to who was also a mutual friend of mine, we didn't know we had this friend in common, I've been saying to the drag queen, oh my God, look at that cute boy, look at that guy, he's so gorgeous. And then Terry walks up to the coat check, and the drag queen says, tell him, don't tell me again, tell him. She's right in front of him, tell him. What did I say to you?
You said,
no.
he said, you've got a really beautiful mouth.
I think it was pretty mouth.
Yeah, okay.
And then what did you say to me?
I said,
Which is even cheesier.
I'm sorry, this is so cheesy. I said, the better to eat you with.
You wouldn't know. I mean, for all your guys, like, it was a pickup line that worked, right? Here we are 16 years later.
16 years later, it worked. One of the greatest things that's happened to us since we left high school and meeting each other is we adopted our son, DJ, who is an amazing kid. He's smart and witty and ironic, sardonic, and he's a great little athlete. He's a snowboarder, a skateboarder, and he's really talented.
We adopted DJ at birth. It was an adoption, so we met his mom before she gave birth, and we still know his mom. And it's really been in the last 12, almost 13 years now. He's going to be 13 in March. It's been great. I didn't think when I came out to my parents in the very early 1980s when AIDS was finally gay to me that I would ever be a dad, that I would ever give my mom and dad another grandchild or make uncles to my brothers and then my sister. I remember going to Paris as a family the first time, the three of us, and DJ, our son, couldn't sleep because he had jet lag, and Terry was exhausted and wanted to sleep, and we kept trying to get DJ to go to bed, and eventually I just figured I'll let Terry sleep, because either all three of us don't sleep or one of us gets to sleep. So I went out at 4 o'clock in the morning and strolled through the streets of Paris with DJ as the sun came up, and we talked. He was 5 years old, 4 years old. We just chatted and we strolled around Notre Dame and Marais, and the bakeries open. We went to the back door of the bakery and ordered some croissants with sugar crystals on them. We got some juice, and we sat and watched the sun come up. You know, the power off in the distance. And it's one of my happiest memories as a parent, as a human.
Some of my best memories include Dan and DJ just being on the top of mountains, complete bluebird, sunny day, and nothing but fresh powder below us, and all three of us getting hit like plowed or black diamonds down together through avalanche country.
Yeah, if you told my musical theater queen 14-year-old self that one day I'd be doing double black diamond runs on a snowboard, I would not have believed you.
Those moments can be so worth sticking out, rolling with the pain and despair of high school. If you just do that, you have moments like that and so many more ahead of you.
And they come when you least expect them. I thought I'd use sleep, not walk around Paris that night. And they come at you all the time. And if you have, the worst time of your life, really, for many days, is high school. And if at that time of your life you choose to end your life, because the bullies really won then, and you deprived yourself of so much potential happiness. If my adult self could talk to my 14-year-old self and tell him anything, to tell him to really believe the lyrics to Somewhere from West Side Story. There really is a place for us. There really is a place for you. And one day you will have friends who love and support you. You will find love. You will find a community. And that life gets better. And the bigots don't win. The people who were picking on you then are completely irrelevant. I don't know where they are now. I don't know if they're happy. I assume that they're miserable. Because miserable people like to make other people miserable. And once I got out of high school, they didn't touch me anymore.
Say anything to any middle school or high schooler watching this, who's having troubles in school, bullies, questioning their sexuality, or just questioning the way they look or act. I would say this: living well is the best revenge. And if you live through high school, which you can, you can totally live through high school, you're gonna have a great life, and it's gonna be envy of all those people that picked on you while you're in high school and middle school. So just stick it out. It's painful now, but it's gonna get so much better.
So what I'm really interested in with this video, but really with the whole campaign in English, the US version of the campaign, is how I think the very smart move there, it's my analysis, my reading of it, is to, in order to make this everyone's problem, in order to make the battle of homophobia, against homophobia, everyone's battle, and in order to make homophobia everyone's enemy, and therefore getting everyone to identify with these two and everyone else who's on their side, without necessarily taking on the identity of gay. In order to do that, I think there's a very particular story that is being used, and I would call this story I would call this story the story of redemption. So this is obviously a trope of religion, and this is very much what is going on with all the stories. It's always framed as some individual made it through years and years of hardship, and at the end of it, there's something wonderful. There's some kind of deliverance to a better state awaiting them, and that deliverance to a better state is what is predicated upon a very specific framing of success, as we're going to be seeing as well. But I'm really interested in how there's a wonderful there's an incredible really change here. If we think about how homosexuality was constructed in relation to the nation in the United States only in the 1950s, as profoundly outside the nation and foreign and un-American, and if we think that now it's possible to frame it instead as everyone's story through a narrative that is fundamentally a religious narrative, or that arcs back to religious sentiments and imagery, that is a shift that is really quite impressive, and that it deserves for us to stay with it a bit longer and ask questions about it really. So there's plenty of academic critiques on the English version of the English language version of the campaign, nothing at all yet on other versions, translated versions. So this is quite typical. This is by just Poir, who's worked a lot on sexual globalization and inequalities embedded in kind of contemporary global maps around homophobia, the kind of stuff that we were talking about earlier. And Poir is really quite scathing of the campaign, as you can see, and she leaves us with a really interesting question, which is how useful is it to imagine troubled gay youth might master their injury and turn blame and guilt into transgression, triumph, and un-American success. Similar point being made here, which I'm also very interested in. I'm very interested in the paradox, in a sense, of a campaign that is explicitly political and explicitly against homophobia, which at the same time is really asking you to hope and to stand back, wait, hope, wait for what happens after after high school. So there's a kind of a tension there, and something that is trying to politicize you, but at the same time is kind of calling for sort of paralysis, at least for the time being. And we'll look at how that plays into the translation as well. So sorry for my my PowerPoint skills leave quite a lot to be desired. So the structure of sociologists have done kind of extensive discourse analysis of the US version of the campaign, and they've come up with a very kind of a recurrent structure of it, really. So they generally start by describing, just as Terry and Dan did, their traumatic experiences of bullying, but these are quite contained and short. So makers of the videos rarely emphasized internal attributions such as self-hatred or victim blaming, and instead were more likely to focus on external attribution by assigning the blame to one of 6 categories: school, family, government, religion, geography, or bullies. The makers of the videos, this is really quite important for us as well in terms of what happens to that characteristic in the translation. The makers of the videos emphasized improvements in family and community. So the kind of the narrative, the progress narrative that all these videos kind of are back to, sees progress in terms of finding a romantic partner, raising children, and encountering widespread acceptance from heterosexual people and LGBT communities. So that also brings us back to family values being very crucial to this process of acceptance of the sexual other. A very common statement that comes back, really is heard lots of times in the US original, is "I'm living proof that things get better." And so that statement is actually being repeated lots of times, but there's also similar statements that all seem to allow the LGBT adult to hold themselves up as a very clear-cut, very readable model of success. But then the question is, how is this kind of, why do we read them so unequivocally as models of success? Often that's done by very clear references to class practices. So one of the most common ways makers of the videos emphasized how their lives had improved was by underscoring familial advancements, but an equally common strategy was to draw on class-based standards of success. These narratives involved the makers of the videos saying, "I have a great job," or "we have good jobs." And then there's lots and lots of references to traveling are strikingly common in these videos. Traveling and going to college. So, again, there's a paradox again there that this particular commentator really stresses, in that the video is the reach is very wide, and it did make a great break, but Meyer is saying it gets better, is relatively modest in its goals, as the project places more emphasis on improving one's life individually after anti-LGBT bullying, rather than changing society and kind of ending that violence. So it's a very particular framing of that kind of political action that isn't actually about ending homophobia, but it's kind of making your way through it. So then there's a question of whether LGBT people are implicitly, LGBT youth are implicitly being asked to adapt to their social marginalization rather than profoundly challenge it. And this is really going to be what I'm asking in terms of the localization of the campaign as well. So all the readings that we've seen so far do stress class hierarchies being kind of class and race, in fact, hierarchies being really imbued in the campaign, kind of structured in the campaign in a sense. And they also stress the kind of the individual narrative, the kind of the centering everything on the one person and on their self-actualization, which is also why the redemptive narrative is so important to this. But what I haven't read in the critiques is the link with that kind of this rhetoric with nationalist discourse. And this is really, there's only one quote that kind of hints at this, and it's, Meyer says, it gets better, it's situated in myths concerning equality of opportunity and the American dream, with the project encouraging makers of the videos to downplay or ignore how their lives have been made easier through structures that privilege them. So here there is he does say that this is deeply infused with right to riches tales, which we do have an instinctive sense that that's why they're linked to a particular narrative, national narrative in the US. But I would take it further than that, and I would say that this campaign works because it's a nationalistic, because it uses nationalist imagery around success and achievement in order to, and takes the queer subject into this particular national narrative. To argue this, I'm really referring again to redemptive, to the narrative of redemption and how that works. And so Dan McAdams is a psychologist who's worked at length with narratives of American generative adults and how they tell their own story. And he's saying, he's really helping us locating these stories in history. And through this quote, I think you get a very good sense of how this, the narrative is really produced through a variety of genres, but also kind of follows through a particular national narrative as well. So the very title of the campaign contains a tension between, it gets better, obviously, contains the kind of optimism that we've just talked about, but at the same time, and also it's a very monolithic message, it doesn't leave room for an exception, it gets better and that's it. However, the very structure of the text does leave room, because obviously it's user-generated content, so if you want to upload your own video saying that it doesn't get better, in fact there's a minority of videos that do say it gets worse. So there is a possibility for exception within the structure of the text, and the text is interesting for us thinking about translation because the very original is multiple and plural, and not one original. But this also kind of helps us reconceptualize translation, as I was saying earlier. So what happens when it gets translated over to Italy? So the framing of, on the website for the Italian version, you have the framing, I'm going to translate this for you obviously, the framing of why they decided to create an Italian version for it. And it's because in the United States, gay and lesbian visibility is much higher than in Italy. In many American states, there are already laws protecting LGBT people and their rights, and rights to couples, and in Italy there's nothing like that. The age of coming out and the possibility of access to help, and as well as bullying, all of that changes depending on the social context and the religious context. But on the whole, American LGBT culture is very different from ours. It's much more complex and bigger. And even when our imagery, Italian gay and lesbian imagery, is often based on representations that do come from the US. So this is framed as a typical kind of context for translating, where the receiving culture is understood as having less than the culture that the text is coming from. And so there is a need to take that, to translate it over to this culture. So, in my analysis of the Italian videos, I've actually noticed quite striking changes. We'll look at what stays the same and what changes in a minute. But firstly, the title is already, the changes happening around the title are already striking. So when the English title it gets better, and so it's very, it doesn't allow, as I said, for exception for different readings. The Italian one becomes le cose cambiano, things change. So already, they don't necessarily get better, they change, but they can change for the better, or they can also change for the worse. So there's something there that is very interesting. And in fact, that has been picked up on by users, because a vast amount of the videos are actually discussing whether things change or not, and how do things change. This is the most obvious difference between the US videos and the Italian ones. There's a lot of discussion of the how it will change. So whilst in the US context, as we've seen, it tends to be individual stories of change and not necessarily interrogating what this change might look like and what it is. In the Italian one, there's a lot of elaboration around how will it change, has it changed for me, I'm not quite sure it has changed, and it's all very, it is not going in one linear kind of direction, and it's not as progress bound as the US campaign seem to be. Another really striking characteristic of the Italian videos, I tried to kind of this is just a few phrases, extracts really from some of the videos, but this kind of rhetoric, which I'm going to go into in a minute, is repeated throughout the videos in a way that doesn't quite match up to the original one. So I have never had this kind of problem, because a lot of it depends on us, how we place ourselves in relation to others and to this situation. So it depends on us, the gay people. Something that got overblown in my head was actually not that big after all. It wasn't for my family and it wasn't for my friends. I live my homosexuality with great serenity, with happiness. One has to be happy, one has to be serene. It is always a bigger problem for you than it is for others. You need to be the one at ease in situations. Don't get paranoid. There's no need to get paranoid. Helping gay people to try and live with themselves. It's us who don't start off well. We don't live our own life well. So there's something incredibly interesting with this. There's a really strong focus on the internal. So I see a real shift there from a focus on the external, move to New York, get a job, get a child, live a normal life, into a focus on the internal. Sort yourself out, look at yourself. It's you who's making this happen. Change, first of all, what happens in your mind. So there's a really interesting shift there. And what is also completely, utterly missing from the Italian campaign is the discourse on class. No one says, we're happy, we have good jobs, we have great jobs. The whole kind of self-actualization through class, there is a real pattern that really structures the narrative in the US campaign, particularly also through the framing of bullies as not as successful as the people talking. So there's often, the bullies will, like Terry said in our video, the bullies will be envious of you. So there's a kind of, he doesn't use explicitly classist language, but there's something there that is being hinted at around how your financial success will be the jealousy of everyone else. And a lot of the videos do employ straightforward classist language around these people are going to be serving you in the restaurant, they're going to work for you once you grow up and you go to New York and get a great job. So there's something there. What I'm really interested in is the inability for a particular national discourse, which to me isn't just linked to neoliberalism, but is also linked to a national narrative. There's something about that became untranslatable, in the Italian campaign. And when that became untranslatable, I would suggest that something else had to come in place of that. And it's very interesting to kind of dwell upon why then what came substitute that was a whole discourse on the self and the regulation of the self, really. How are we doing for time? Okay, great. So I think I'm happy with, I think this kind of is good enough as a conclusion for what I wanted to bring home, really. So I'm really looking forward to discussion, to questions and comments.
I have a question. I'll start. Thank you. This was so fascinating. So what do you think, then, to take the sort of the next obvious question, what do you think it is about the local Italian culture that necessitates this kind of shift to, or brings about the shift to self, as opposed to the sort of capitalist kind of, story of redemption, right? What do you think? What are your preliminary thoughts on that?
I would say that I think a really interesting area of research on that would be around what I was trying to say in the beginning, around how the path towards gay liberation in the US is really about economic conditions more than it is. So it's about particular events in the 50s and 60s, which also generated a set of links between the state and gay communities, and links and which also allowed a set of resources to be there around help, so in terms of institutions and actual places to go to, and all of that it doesn't quite exist in the same way in Italy. So I would say a language of and the same goes for the legal apparatus around protection at work. I think because all of that is missing, because of all of that rhetoric around being protected to go off and create your own life is missing, then something else needs to emerge as a response. The same kind of production of solutions is incited by the very format of the campaign that asks you to exchange tips and come up with solutions. But because because there isn't a place socially and culturally to go and look for them, then the site for that becomes internal. I would say that's where I'm going towards.
Have you thought about thinking, just as a follow-up, that the sort of the story, the American story, is a more sort of Protestant story,
Absolutely.
whereas
Absolutely.
the Italian one is a more Catholic?
This is another really important. So I'm very much at the start with this, and I want to keep this open. So I don't want to determine my answers. But I think there's something there around the relationship between religion and the state as well, religion and national narratives. So it's very interesting that, like, instinctively people would assume in a country as Catholic as Italy, as religious as Italy, why are people not using narratives of redemption there as well? Why are they not using? But there's something about them not being repurposed to describe the secular in the same way, which I think has a lot to do with the relationship between the church and the state, and also then also the body and the state and the church, because Italy is also one of the structural differences that the US has a history of criminalization of homosexuality, which Italy hasn't. So not even during fascism was homosexual sexual activity between men criminalized, whereas the US had sodomy laws. So this is a really important structural difference, and that goes back to the fact that in a Catholic country like Italy, it would be the church that is in charge of sorting that out. It wouldn't be the state. That would be, if the state took it upon themselves to produce rules around sexuality, it would take away from what the church is doing. So I guess also the history of the conflict between church and state in Italian modernity is crucial to answering these questions as well.
That was a really fascinating lecture, and I feel like it raised a lot of questions that I know are the ones that you're actively working on. And I'm really interested in one of your research questions, which is what does it look like when we have this English word gay that gets deployed in all these other contexts, and what does that word bring with it when it's localized? But when we see the differences between the U.S. It Gets Better campaign and the Italian, was it Things Change campaign, it seems that there's a marked difference. So I was wondering if you could speak to that idea. I know this is preliminary for you, but about whether or not this English word gay does bring with it a certain set of discourses and narratives that are Western specific.
Thank you so much for this question, because that helps me kind of first be a bit more precise with what I was trying to say quite rapidly at the end. The videos do fundamentally keep the same structure in a lot of ways. For example, I would say that the signifier gay helps most people understand a past, a present, and a future in quite a linear way. And that is done through gay. Because what I mean by that is there is a reference to childhood being really difficult, teenagehood being really difficult, and then the present being much better. And that is, the present is made better by the access to gay as an identity through, for example, there's a lot of references to meeting friends. So whilst in the US campaign, it gets better because you get a great job, it's generally because you get a great job and because you find love. In the Italian context, love comes first, and there's something, the intimacy, there's a lot more kind of elaboration around intimacy. So it gets better because I was able to find certain sites of intimacy. The couple form is the main one, but friends is also often reiterated. So I found my community, I Googled lesbian theater, and then I have the best friends that are into drama, stuff like that. You do get that kind of on a regular basis. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, I think so.
I think what I think it is that gay is not, gay in translation is fragmentary, and so the dubbing metaphor I really like. I think there's a disjuncture, but it's there and it does regulate things in a particular way. I think as well the fact that there's that thing around the self, the concentration, the work on the self, and the regulation of the self that we see very prominently in the Italian campaign is also, I think, has been analyzed in the US one as well, in the sense that, so the critiques of it not actually being a political campaign because it asks you to wait for when you finish college, or when you finish high school. I think there's a link there. So there's a system that ideologically the two are brought together by that, by a kind of a call to depoliticization almost implicitly. But the way that call sounds, it's different. It's not the same, if you know what I mean.
I don't know if this can be answered, but are there examples of like campaigns that started in other countries that have been kind of appropriating to U.S. culture? Like I feel like the It's Better campaign and like a lot of LGBT activist movements have started in the U.S. and kind of it's been adapted to other cultures. But has there ever been an instance where like a specific organization in another country kind of made its way to the U.S. and like how it was different?
This is an excellent question. I don't know about this, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was just a long shot. I was so curious.
This is a really, really interesting question. I would actually look, to be honest, I'd be surprised if there is a lot of work on this. But I will have to see if there is, and if there is, that would be really, really interesting to see how that's
Yeah.
about. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I was just curious.
Yeah.
It's something I'll have to look up too. So.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't mean, people who said it's not as good, but I feel like the globalization aspect is very important because it seems like that everything that was American was just stripped out. I feel like they, from my time in Italy, it seemed more things that were more important, I guess for us Americans that are capitalized are socialized. Because when I was in the military, people whose family members came over would like get trucked and hurt. So I was in the military and go to the hospital. And they were like, no, let's go to the hospital. And they're like, when they went there, they knew it was free. So I think all these this capitalist ideas like the American dream aspect that is in the American version is taken out because there's more of a social family type of from what I got in Italy,
Yeah.
people arrive when they get married in Italy, that's their thing, from what I got.
But these are people who don't have the right to get married.
But that's what I'm saying. Like they're in America, that is the standard, and it's kind of like I think you said it in that they're kind of like heteronormative. They're like bringing this. They're bringing that heteronormalization of it onto the gayness,
Yeah.
to the gay aspect, and in Italy it's kind of like it's more social. Like you said, like they're going out and they're finding their community, and that's what changes it. I guess in high school where you're ostracized, once you get out of there, you're getting closer to your community because you have that feeling that most people do once they get out of high school. Just the globalization, because I feel like that had to be stripped from the whole idea of going to Italy.
I think I'm not so much. So Italy does translate a huge amount. Italy does already exist in this context of flow, of transition flow from the US. So there's a lot of, so the dubbing metaphor is very appropriate to Italy because we do have all the American TV programs and films dubbed, and so they in that way they have been localized, and so that kind of narrative of self-actualization in the American dream has been translated. It's very prominent. So maybe I should have pointed that out. I mean, it is everywhere. It would have been easy to access it, but it wasn't accessed. It wasn't accessed, and I think it's something that says more about gay identity in Italy and that vision than it does about that vision being there at all. You know what I mean? I think as well, it's also about the two different, so long before the Expression Project, there would have been a gay movement, a gay social movement in Italy, which looks very, very differently from the US one. It's taking from very different categories of agency, categories of liberation. So it's not, it is partly taken from an American role model, but then it kind of also then is fused with ideas that are already circulating in Italy, political discourse that is already circulating in Italy, which is around liberation, is just framed in very different ways.
So I think that it's access points that drives and is the vehicle that makes it get better for younger people, in a sense that it's the access point to a community. It's an access point to a knowledge that there are people like him or her who encounter the same thing. So I am curious about what the opportunities are for a longitudinal examination of the situation, in a sense that younger and younger people are having more and more access because of technology, because of the technology boom, like an 8-year-old can Google, or a 5-year-old knows that he's an iPad, and I think that it just gets the subset of people that can access that knowledge base of what's happening out there that is relatable to their own personal experience. So I think it's the whole dynamism between technology and the population that makes it interesting.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind when you say this as well is that one of the things that we can say about the Italian campaign is that you also, there's much more talk about how the campaign has helped for it to get better. So in the Italian, you often hear people say, yes, and it has got, things have changed for me since I've seen that video of the campaign. So there's a self-referential thing within the campaign which isn't really there in the US one. In general, it's interesting how the Italian one, as a translation, I think, is also, it's talking about itself, it's talking about the campaign. There's a lot of talk of whether if things do change or not, whether the campaign is kind of references to the campaign bringing change in itself. So there's something about the translation also creating a space for reflecting on the format, which is quite interesting. But in terms of your really interesting point on things changing and time and new generations, I think time is very crucial to this in many ways, because obviously also the narratives are always framed in temporal terms as narratives of progress. So I really have to think about this, the generational thing in it as well. It's really important. Thank you.
I don't know if you touched on this a little bit, but I guess I noticed that I feel like at least from my experiences and the experiences of people that I know, like a lot of times when people in America are like persecuted for being, or bullied for being gay, it's less like being gay or like gay activities and more like the perception of gayness. So like, a lot of people are bullied for, I know there's a really cool documentary coming out about like kind of like the gay voices and like how like the voices of gay men are like more high pitched. And like I know like in my experiences like people have like been like I like faced bullying because like my voice has been higher or like the way that I dress. And do you think that could maybe be the reason why in America like we focus more on like the socioeconomic or like kind of the economic ramifications, like it gets better, like as in like you'll find economic success because it kind of comes from a more external rather than internal place? I guess I'm not sure if I'm phrasing this correctly.
No, I think this is a really interesting point. So there's something that I'm slightly uncomfortable with the framing that I didn't quite point out. I don't actually agree with many of the critiques of the campaign in American context because they're very judgmental and they're very much about kind of pointing the finger to, and they also rely on an idea of privilege that to me is a bit too more stable. So what I am trying to do with my work is as well to see how things change in the translation, how meanings are less stable than we think of them as being. And so I think that speaks to what you're saying as well. So another thing I didn't say is that the Italian translation was also prompted by a similar kind of spate or homophobic hate crime in Italy, very similar to the teen suicides in particular, which did look very similar. From the way the news reported it looked very similar to what was happening with Larry King, and I think that happened around that in the US as well. So this gender representation is definitely an issue for the Italian campaigns as well. There's a lot of talk of particularly, for both actually, for both female assigned and male assigned people. So there's for the female assigned people, there's a lot of talk of I grew up being shouted at, you're a boy, you're a girl. And for the male assigned people, there's a lot of talk around makeup and skirts, and so that does exist. But it kind of I think what I was trying to say when I answered Jack's question as well, the very setup, the very economic and cultural and social setup of the second half of the 20th century in the two countries is so different that things won't translate because of that as well. There's a particular binary around the rural and the urban at play in the US that doesn't quite translate to Italy in the same way. The idea that there's the rural backwater that you need to escape from to then go to the, that is a particular US mapping of space and freedom. So this is, I think, what doesn't quite translate as well. Thank you so much.
You just kind of touched on this, but like, and also in your presentation, but would you say that, like, I just read an article recently about like a subculture in England about Muslim men who are married but are would identify as having like same-sex desires, and like I'm just thinking now, like, would you say that like the globalization of like this gay community can like isolate people because of these how these maybe these campaigns might not adapt, like, or might not have a correct adaptation? Because I'm thinking about this campaign, it gets better, and to these men, they can't even relate to this campaign because they, through their own culture, they're living like the way they might find liberation, like when they find liberation is completely different. Do you think that can like isolate them, make them feel even worse if they can't find freedom in this like certain context?
So I think in my kind of quite sketchy background theory at the start, I mentioned an author called Joseph Massad. If people are interested in this particular debate, Desiring Arabs is a great book for that. And then also Terrorist Assemblages, Terrorism in a Queer Time by Jasmine Poir is also a great book on this. And I think what this kind of field of scholarship is doing is saying, yes, same-sex practices don't mean the same thing everywhere. And the meaning that they go to take does have a lot to do with space and economics too. So I think as well what's very difficult for us is because we are very, because this is the life we live, and so we have to live it, we can't deconstruct all the categories that we inhabit all the time. So it's good for us to take things for granted and to see gay to an extent self-evidently. But then when we look at a different context, I think some of the questions, the very question that you asked, are they isolated? I think that is quite entrenched in our experience of homophobia, where homophobia and isolation, homophobia and silence are one and the same. Same-sex, I mean, the thing with Italy, for example, because same-sex practices were never criminalized, there is a lot of same-sex sex that happens quite freely. Whether that's called gay and whether that's celebrated, no, that's not. But I think there's a set of questions really around identity, which I'm not going to answer. They need to be open questions really around identity and power relations and who gets to represent who, I think, on a global scale. I think.
Any further? All right, thank you. Please join me in saying